So, this is our much anticipated, long awaited midterm review. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be going over all of the questions that were asked in the midterm exam, and we're going to be talking about kind of things that I'm looking for as answers. Now, this isn't just an idea of to kind of maybe help you get a sense of the midterm. Obviously, that's good, right? But the real concern, the real issue we want to be thinking about is the final exam. So that said, let's get started. This exam consisted of 25 questions. The final exam will also consist of 25 questions. On the midterm exam, each of these questions was worth 2 points apiece. That's going to be a little bit different. On the final exam, those are going to be worth 3 points apiece. So the stakes go up a little bit on the final exam. Of the 25 questions that we're going to cover in the midterm exam, I'm going to use some of those questions word for word in the final exam. So not a bad idea as you're watching this to take notes. Be aware of a couple of things as we go through it. First of all, not all of you took the questions in exactly this same order. Even though I'll duplicate questions, I won't always necessarily ask them in exactly the same way. I may reverse things, but certainly I'll use these as guides. So kind of get a sense of that. Also, I did ask 2 questions twice, and I'll give that was a mistake on your midterm, so hopefully you knew that one. But here we go. Let's start with the first question that I'm going to cover, the difference between sophistry and argument. I love these kinds of questions. I like talking about them. Strongest answers always look for things that are the same and then talk about how they're different. They do a little bit of like, and then they do a little bit of difference. In this case, the important thing to remember is that sophistry is about winning the argument. It's about the relationship between the interlocutor and the arguer who is a sophist wants to win the argument and doesn't really care about whether or not they're actually finding the truth, right? The argument is about proof. That is to say, it's about truth seeking. It's about trying to figure out what is probably the right answer to our questions. And so in that case, argument is always about looking at what makes the best case, not about being right. Remember that sophists, because they're about winning, often will engage in things like equivocation. That is to say, they benefit from lack of clarity, whereas arguments are always about clarity. And that while sophists may be selective in terms of which facts, we're not going to call them outright liars. That's a little bit different than I think a sophist. But where a sophist might be selective in the facts that they choose, argument is all about the most accurate evidence, the best data available. Sophists may be willing to engage in fallacious forms of argument in order to make their point, but argument, again, is all about developing sound logic. So the two things may look similar in many respects, but have quite a few differences. So, all right, let's talk about the next question. What is a hypothetical syllogism? Now, best answers for this one, right? Okay, not just the if-then, I definitely want to see that, but I also really like seeing the words antecedent and consequent, right? Give those if-thens names. A hypothetical syllogism is a formal logic, right? We know that. Okay, it's a type of syllogism, so it's deductive. It has an antecedent and a consequent, an if and a then, right? And the best answers tend to give examples, right? Okay, sometimes your examples demonstrate that you in fact aren't quite sure what a hypothetical syllogism is, but it always establishes that you're definitely sure and that you know the difference between, understanding the concept and just being able to regurgitate it. I like examples. Enthymemes. An enthymeme, this is remember, this is part of logic, it's part of rhetoric, it's the unspoken but often necessary assumptions, right? So when we're talking about enthymemes, the word that we're really going to be looking for here most of the time is setting, right? Okay, I love the idea of the word setting showing up in our answer for enthymeme. They're an unspoken assumption, they're necessary to the argument, and they must be supplied by the auditor in order for the argument to make sense to them. So, for example, if I were to say, hey, look, it's wrong to lock children in closets, my claim, because reason, that's torture. Well, now most of you would nod and say, well, yeah, if it's torture to lock kids in closets, then it's wrong to lock kids in closets, because you're willing to supply the unspoken and yet necessary premise that torture is wrong. If you are of the opinion that torture is right, then you cannot get from its torture to its wrong, right? It's an unsupplied but necessary assumption, is what we call an enthymeme. What is abduction? Looks like I forgot the setup for this, so I'll give you a second to write down what is abduction. But remember, abduction is a type of logic. right? So it belongs to the same category as deduction, but it is actually kind of a sub-variety-ish. It's very related to induction, right? It's a kind of induction. And specifically when we're talking about abduction, it's the logic of the gaps, right? It is a form of induction in which an intermediating step is filled in. Mendel and his genes, the discovery of genes by looking at pea plants, that is a good example of abduction. So, in this one, and I asked you actually two questions in which I asked you to define setting, so this is one of the ones that I doubled down on, but in terms of an argument, a verbal act in which a claim is supported by reasons within a setting, what does setting mean? Okay, this is one I asked twice. Right, so, okay, when we're talking about a setting, we're referring to two things, and you're going to want to have both of these things on here if you're going to get the correct answer, which is to say that a setting refers to our assumptions about the world, things that are real, things that are possible, things that are good, right? Things that ought to be versus things that should not be. So there's assumptions about the world and our assumptions about arguments. What counts as valid evidence, right? What counts as rules of inference? What are perfectly reasonable things to assume and that we do not need to prove? What kinds of questions can be accepted without evidence? What do we know about the world? What do we know about arguments? These are the two things that are included within the setting. When I do refer to things specifically from readings, things that I asked you to read, I'll put that author's name right there in it so that I'm referring to what that author meant by this. And in this case, they're both important for a free society, and I think that is a really crucial part to this evidence, right? Or excuse me, this answer, that we're talking about that they are both important for a free society. And if we don't have that, that's going to be a problem in our answer. But whereas advocacy is the ability to speak on any subject, inquiry is the ability to study or examine any subject, and that means the right to access information, right? To not just study, but to access information. The right to inquiry, the freedom to inquire is different than from the freedom of advocacy, the right to speak, but both of them are kind of preconditions for a free society, at least according to Windus and Hastings. There you go. All right. Windus and Hastings, we have another question that's from them. They identify what they call 4 principal threats to the freedom of speech or the freedom of expression. They use those terms rather interchangeably throughout the work. Those four threats are apathy, right? People simply don't care if people's rights are being taken away. They don't care about their free speech rights. It doesn't matter if someone's free speech rights are being censored, right? Ignorance, okay? Ignorance, for example, when people don't realize that there's a free speech issue that's involved, they're simply unaware that people's rights are being taken away from them or that their own rights are being stripped away from them slowly, perhaps. Intolerance, that's the degree to which we simply do not like other people's freedom of speech. You know, we're happy about our own freedom of speech, but when other people attempt to speak freely, we get very, very upset by that, right? Intolerance. And the last are laws which strike at free expression. Now, obviously, there's some laws that are straight up, like you can't say that, it's illegal. But also laws that do things like make certain forms of expression, like gathering in a park, right? Like more than a few people in a park, you have to have a permit, and, you know, the person who has permits maybe is apathetic, ignorant, or intolerant, right? Okay, all kinds of things can affect freedom of speech, but we're talking about apathy, ignorance, intolerance, and laws. Those are the 4 things that Windus and Hastings identify. So the square of opposition, this one would be so much easier if you could just draw a picture. I know, right? But you are going to have to explain it, and there are a couple of key things that I'm looking for here in your explanation, right? Okay, that it is a way of organizing and understanding logical claims, right? But there's a couple of key terms I'm going to be looking for. I want to see the word universal. I want to see the word particular. I want to see the word affirmative, and I want to see the word negative. I'm going to be super jazzed if I see the words quantity and if I see the words quality. Those are going to be a couple of things that I'm looking for in that answer, right? Okay, so if you're going to describe the square of opposition, then I want to see the words universal, particular, affirmative, negative, and I'd super duper like to see the words quantity and quality. Things about the square of opposition, remember that what it is, it's a starting point for inference, right? Okay, it establishes a relationship between claims. So once we know what a claim is, we can put it on the square of opposition, and we can immediately start making some inferences about that, and in terms of setting it up. So it's a very useful tool or guide that we use. Remember that an argument is a verbal act, so in order to understand verbal acts, we have to understand symbols. Verbs, words, after all, are symbols. So the first and most important thing to remember is that a symbol is something that stands for something else, right? Okay, the octagonal red sign stands for the need to stop, or the imperative to stop, right? Something stands for something else. But what you're going to want to be able to do is differentiate between signs and symbols. That's kind of the crucial thing that I'm looking for here. This is what's going to show me you know what a symbol is and not have a sense of what a symbol is. So remember that signs are natural, symbols are not. Signs are connected to the thing that they identify or stand for. There's a relationship between them, whereas for symbols, they are arbitrary. And signs are naturally occurring, they just show up, whereas symbols are intentional. They're specifically designed or made or put together to do that. So be able to identify those things, and you're going to do great if that question comes up on the final. Understanding the difference between expertise and authority, that's another really important one that we want to get. We want to understand the difference between expertise and authority. Remember that experts, education, training, experience, that is to say they have some kind of special knowledge that everyone doesn't have access to. There is that question of ethos. We can always apply ethos to experts. We'll talk about ethos actually in a later question, right? Authorities, on the other hand, what authorities say is given, right? It's final. It's not subject to debate, okay? The authority said it, we accept it, that's it. That's what makes it an authority, okay? To say that one is an authority is the right to assert what's true in a given case. The right to say, all other arguments aside, this is the final answer. That's what makes an authority an authority. Expertise is always going to be open to debate. Multiple experts can both look at the same evidence and come to disagreements, in which case we have to weigh the ethos of the expert. But an authority, if they're an authority, their decision is final. You can accept the authority or you cannot accept the authority, but you don't debate once the authority is established, right? Okay, if the rules by the university are the authority and have the right to define what plagiarism is, then we're done. Once we agree on that, then we don't argue what plagiarism is, we simply look it up in the rule book. Which leads us actually to this question. This is one of those questions where you had to read something and give me your kind of best guess. The best answer for this one is authority, right? This is actually the example I think I used in the lecture, so that should kind of help in this regard. But the idea here is that there are rules. They are defined by a particular set of policies, and that's what the panel defers to. And then notice, I think in this case, the panel says, you know, there's a lot of points on both sides, but frankly, they don't matter because rules is rules, right? So that's, I think, a clear sense of appeal to authority because the rules are set up to have the final say. Now remember, your answer can't just be like authority, period, and then you're done. Okay, that is also a guess, right? Just because you happen to guess right doesn't mean that you're going to get full points. What you need to do here in this answer is show me that you understand what authority is, which means that you probably got partial credit if you said expertise, right? If you said, hey, we have a panel, this panel is empowered to weigh all of the evidence because they have special knowledge of the issues. They appeal to this special knowledge that they have of the rules, right? Okay, and they came up and determined that. Not an authority, but an expert. Now, don't get me wrong, you're wrong, okay? This is very much an authority, right? But if you're able to say, hey, here's what I think it is, and here's what I think that means, then you're going to get at least some credit for that. Way different from if you just put down authority, in which case you're also going to get some credit, but you're not going to get full credit in either case. You have to identify it properly and explain your answer. Same thing with this one, right? Okay, the correct answer for this is that it's a disjunctive syllogism. Okay, it's a disjunctive syllogism because there are two possible choices, and it really is set up as an either-or equation, right? It must be one, it cannot be both, it cannot be neither, right? That's very much the definition of a disjunctive syllogism. Several folks put hypothetical syllogism, right? And they explained what they meant by a hypothetical syllogism. And if you did that, you got partial credit for showing me you knew what a hypothetical syllogism was, and having an answer that, while not correct, also wasn't entirely off base and ridiculous either, right? If you put authority down in this case, yeah, you got a 0. You know, you got no points for that. Okay, here's another question, right? What's the difference between a scientific attitude and a scientific pose? The scientific attitude and the scientific pose. Generally speaking, the attitude is good and the pose is bad. And if you can remember that, that's going to help you guide your way through the answer. Remember that an attitude shares the same values of science and tries to do what science does, even though it's not able to establish it perfectly, right? That is to say, it likes to begin with a problem based on prior knowledge, a hypothesis that's able to be tested, right? That's able to be verified or falsified, and then the actual testing of that. It's the persistent application of reason, which is to say that it always frames its things in terms of the possibility of error, or alternative explanations may also be justified. It likes to look at lots of different perspectives. The pose is different, right? What makes the pose is that it attempts to look like science because it wants the authority of science, right? It wants to be able to say, that's done, why science, right? We don't need to ask that question anymore. Why science, right? It looks like science, it sounds like science, but really it apes science rather than emulates science. You know, a real high-level answer in this case, one of the things to look for is that while the scientific attitude will often engage in use of concrete, measurable, objective, positive terms, the scientific pose often relies on ideological or what we call dialectical terms, right? Okay, so positive terms versus dialectical terms, that's a kind of insightful answer you might want to think about as you prep for the final. Another question I asked twice was the question about verbal aggression and what verbal aggression means. The important things to remember about verbal aggression as it is not an argument. It's like argument in the sense that people often use the word arguments to talk, or an argument to talk about what we now would refer to as a verbal aggression. I think that's really, really important that people use the word argument to describe it sometimes, but that it is not argument because it is not reason-based. It may involve claims, it may involve settings, it may involve all kinds of things, but it's not reason-based. It uses coercion, right? The threat of violence, the fear of yelling, silent treatment, things like that are what it uses in order to establish the conditions under which you would accept, under which an auditor and an interlocutor would accept the claim. Okay, so now we want to define theory. There's really a couple of important things I'm looking for when you're defining theory, right? First, theories are abstractions, nets that catch the world, lots of metaphors that we can use, but the key thing here is that it's a picture or representation of a phenomenon, and that picture or representation is distinct from the phenomenon itself, right? A picture of the world is not the same as the world, okay? And a theory is a picture or a representation, an idea about something that we see in the world. But the second crucial part is that this picture does something that the world itself doesn't, and that is it explains the world in some way, right? Okay, so as you can see, the sun is moving across the sky over there, right? Now, you may want to explain why Jim is wearing a sweater in this particular video, but he's wearing often like shorts and t-shirts in his other videos. Why it's green and leafy in some, but now I look like I'm in a totally different place, right? When you say, well, look at it. You know, I've got a theory, angle of light, colors of the leaves, blah, blah. This lecture was shot in the fall. Well, a lot of Jim's other lectures were shot in the summer, right? You have a theory, light, colors of leaves, all of these concepts, and you use that to explain this problem or thing that you see in the world, right? Theories provide explanations. That's the other thing we want to do, right? All right. Argument and rhetoric. This is another good one. I do love comparison contrast questions, right? Arguments are, rhetoric is like sophistry, right? We already had that question a little bit ago, right? Arguments are like sophistry, but that's the sense that they are not arguments and that they are strategic, right? So that's a good comparison that you might want to make. They are strategic in the sense that they're concerned with actually persuading people, not just proving things. But unlike that, right, what involves rhetoric is the selection of arguments, the arrangements of arguments, how arguments are juxtaposed with non-argumentative elements of discourse, right? So you can be engaging in rhetoric and still be a sophist. Sophists engage in rhetoric in the sense that both are strategic kinds of actions, but rhetoric is concerned with the selection of arguments. Like if I can only present one because I don't have time to present you 100 of them, which one do I choose? That's a rhetorical decision, right? How I arrange the arguments. If I have 3 arguments, which one am I going to do first? Which one am I going to do second? Which one am I going to do third, right? How am I going to explain and clarify those arguments so that you know exactly what's going on, right? How am I going to set those arguments up so that you understand them? So rhetoric is concerned with non-argumentative aspects of an argumentative work or text, right? Things that are organizers, previews, reviews, conclusions, right? Okay, introductions, and things that are clarifiers, right? So definitions, narration, statement of fact, establishing stasis, those kinds of things. All right, let's move on to ethos. Okay, ethos applies to 2 forms of evidence, and ethos is about assessing evidence. That's what's really important. Ethos is about assessing evidence, and we can only assess testimony or expertise using ethos. It does not apply to authority, right? So, when we're talking about ethos, I'm looking for 2 specific words here, very specific words I want us to show up in answers here. I want to see the word intelligence. That is to say, what does the person know and how well do they know it? Now, for a witness, that involves like how close were they to the phenomenon? Do they have a direct line of sight? Whereas for an expert, it might be how much experience do they have? Where do they get their education? But both of them have that knowledge equation, that knowledge element that applies to their evidence that they give. Both are also concerned with matters of goodwill, right? Okay, that is not to say do they know what happened, but are they going to be honest about what they know, right? Okay, so intelligence is do they actually know? Goodwill has to do with character, or will they really tell the truth about what it is that they know? Are they unduly biased, for example? When you're talking about ethos, I really want to see all these things showing up. I really would like to see all of this stuff coming through in your answer in some way or another, and the more explicit you can be about it, the better. This is a question a lot of folks missed. What does it mean to distribute a term? This is one that threw a lot of you, I think, for a loop. You have to go back to your rules of formal syllogisms, the 7 formal fallacies, and the structure of syllogisms. There are actually 2 of the 7 rules of formal fallacies that have to do with the distribution of terms. And what to distribute means to apply it to the class as a whole. Okay, so usually, not all the time, we're talking about a universal term, right? All or none. All of it. And if it's not distributed, then we cannot have a valid syllogism, right? So for example, if I have a categorical syllogism that all crocodiles are reptiles and all caimans are crocodiles, right, then I can conclude that all caimans must also be reptiles. But that depends on the distribution of the terms, right? If I don't distribute one or more of the terms, then I end up with a syllogism that is in fact entirely fallacious, right? Because I haven't distributed, okay, a term, the terms correctly, all right? Very, very good. Okay. Whew. What is the difference between contradictory and contrary? Contradictory and contrary. This is a place where you want to go back to your square of opposition. The square of opposition answers that question for you. Now, obviously, if you could draw a picture, that'd be super duper helpful. But since you can't draw a picture, you have to tell me what's going on. And you tell me what's going on really simply, right? Okay, a universal affirmative and a universal negative are contrary, right? Contrary claims are like in quantity, right? But are of opposing qualities, right? Universal affirmative, universal negative. Those are contrary claims. Contradictory, those remember, right? Those remember are catty-corner to one another on the square of opposition. They're catty-corner to one another. So that's what makes them contradictory, is that they are opposing in both quantity and in quality. Stop. Our next question is, what is the scientific method? What is the scientific method? Scientific method has three parts: identify the problem, formulate a hypothesis, test the hypothesis. Those are the three parts of the scientific method. That's baseline. In order to get credit, you're going to have those three parts. I do like other things, right? There are other things that you can say to elaborate on this and really show me that you understand what that means. I'm always looking for you to show me what your answers mean. Show me you get what's going on, right? So in order to identify problems, we have to have some level of prior knowledge, right? In order to be scientific, the hypothesis has to be empirical, that we have to be subject to, it has to be subject to verification and or falsification, right? And that the hypothesis, in order to test it, that test has to be repeatable, right? Okay, the results have to be able to be duplicated by other people who are doing it. So this is how you develop that answer and really show me like you understand what the scientific method is. All right, let's talk about inductive and deductive logic and the difference between those two. So these are both forms of reasoning, they're both forms of logic, but they're different in terms of this type of probability that their answers give us. Deductive logic, while it's a little bit more limited in terms of what it can do, always gives us answers that must be true. If the premises are true, the conclusions must be true. On the other hand, inductive logic, if the premises are true, the conclusion is still only probably true, and it's the degree of probability that we're trying to measure in terms of inductive reasoning. We sometimes call deductive reasoning formal logic. We sometimes call inductive reasoning informal logic. Deductive reasoning makes use of syllogisms. Inductive reasoning at its highest level functions as the scientific method, right? So lots of things that we can talk about in terms of understanding the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning. Remember, your purpose, your point is always to show me that you get it, okay? All right, so what is dogma? Dogma comes from authorities, right? So there you go, boom, right there. You got to have that answer. You're not getting points if I don't see the word authority in there somewhere, okay? The other thing that you can talk about here is how we assess that, right? Now notice when we talk about expertise, when we talk about testimony, we talk about witnesses, we might talk about ethos. What do we talk about? We're talking about authorities. Well, authorities are determined their legitimacy of the authority, right? So if it's accepted by the auditor, if it's accepted by the interlocutor, then it's final and period. It doesn't need to be debated anymore, right? Okay, so we can debate about the scope of the authority. You know, does that authority have the right to be an authority in this particular context, right? We can talk about the range of the authority, the legitimacy of the authority, what they can and cannot do. But once we establish that it's an authority, then all other questions related to that authority are now settled. That's what authority means. What is a concept cluster? What is a concept cluster? Remember, concepts are the building blocks of theory, okay? They're the smallest part of a theory is a concept, right? The easiest little atom of a theory. Clusters are interconnected groups of concepts, right? That is to say that they're concepts that we see appearing together, all right? Now, concepts aren't just out there as a kind of pile. When we see concepts, we start to have this kind of idea of networks or interrelationships, right? Okay, what some people call webs of meaning start to take place. Concept clusters are when concepts become consistent, that is to say, when we see one, we start seeing others, right? And they become mutually reinforcing, right? To the point where we can start to make predictions and formulate explanations based on seeing what gets clustered together and when things aren't clustered together, right? This is how theories are built, is they're built first by identifying concepts, then by identifying concept clusters, then by identifying relationships. There's some other steps involved in there, but that's kind of the through line that we're looking for here. So that's it. That was all the questions on the midterm exam. There were 2 of them that were repeated, so we went through 23 separate questions. You will have 25 questions on your final exam. Each of those questions will be worth 3 points. That exam will be available to you on D2L on Friday, December 1st. That's when it's going to get unlocked, and it will close on Friday, December 8th. That's the very last day of the class. I can't possibly give you more time to take it in that period, but on Friday, December 1st, that's when it's going to close, and on or open, and on Friday, December 8th, that's when it's going to close. So thanks very much. I do have a couple of other parting comments for you, so don't go quite yet. Remember that the final exam is open notes, so you can go back to your notes, you can go back to the video lectures, you can go back and rewatch entire lectures if you need to find answers on things. Read unread chapters of books that you were given. You can do that. It is open notes. Remember though, Googling answers very often is just going to get you to the wrong answer. Okay, you're not going to get close if you define enthymeme in a way that's radically different because you Googled what is an enthymeme. Okay, you're going to get that answer wrong. Okay, you've got to go to your notes. I don't give you answers based on Google. Okay, and that hurt people on the last exam. That hurt people on the midterm. They didn't go back and look in their notes. They tried to Google the answer from Wikipedia or something. And again, I don't punish you for it. I'm not like being like, this is from Google, and I don't get. No, you got it wrong. That's what happened. You wrote down an answer that was incorrect. Absolutely, 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 absolutely. You do not share answers with other people. You don't share answers with other people in this class. You don't share answers with people in other classes, right? Okay, this lecture that I put out there, that's a lecture. That's in the world. You can share this with literally anybody, right? Okay, go out and share it with people if they want to help it study. I don't care if you share it with your roommate who's taking this class in the spring. Okay, that's no problem with me, right? This lecture exists in the world. But when you are sitting down taking that exam in front of you, that is your own work, and if you share that work, that's going to be considered cheating, and if I catch you cheating, then I have to give you an F for the class. Please don't make me do that. My advice to you is to remember that we're taking two parts of this. Remember, there's an essay portion to this exam. My advice to you is to take this part of the exam first. Take the objective portion first. That's going to help reinforce vocabulary, help get you thinking about concepts, so that you can then apply those concepts to the online exam, right, for the study portion. Remember that online portion too, that essay portion, you're going to get a link on D2L that's going to take you to Qualtrics. Remember to follow the instructions. You'll have more information on that. Okay, do the objective part first, then do the essay part. Hope this was valuable, hope it was useful, hope the wind didn't screw up the speaker too bad so that you could understand all the words that are coming out of my mouth. So, much appreciated, and thank you.